Burkina Faso's interim president Ibrahim Traoré delivered a fiery and emotionally charged speech that sent shockwaves across the international community as he openly condemned the ongoing Israel-Gaza conflict. His tone was unapologetic, fierce, and filled with visible anger, breaking the usually restrained diplomatic norms many African leaders have followed. Standing before a backdrop of national and Pan-African flags, Traoré did not mince his words, accusing global powers of hypocrisy and double standards. He said the world had grown deaf to the cries of Palestinian children and blind to the devastation raining down on Gaza, while the same powers who once spoke of human rights now look away in silence. His voice trembled with fury as he described the images coming from Gaza as unbearable and a stain on the conscience of mankind. He condemned not only the military actions but also what he called the selective humanity of the international system, where some lives are valued and others are expendable depending on geopolitics. What truly shocked the world was not just the content of his speech but the intensity with which he delivered it. Traoré called out international organizations by name, accusing them of complicity through inaction. He questioned why no serious sanctions were being considered, no emergency military aid sent to Gaza, and no accountability being enforced on the aggressors. He asked rhetorically whether justice was reserved only for powerful nations and their allies, and whether African nations were expected to remain silent observers in the face of such injustice. His boldness echoed across the continent and beyond, sparking praise from many African youths and Pan-Africanist voices, while also drawing sharp criticism from Western diplomats who called the speech undiplomatic and dangerously polarizing. Despite the political risks, Traoré stood his ground, stating that Burkina Faso would never remain silent in the face of genocide masked as self-defense. He compared the suffering of Palestinians to the historical pain of colonized Africa, insisting that the time for neutral language had passed. His government declared that it would reevaluate all diplomatic and economic relations with any country complicit in what he called the massacre of a people. This declaration caused ripples across international relations and media outlets, with some calling it a turning point in Africa's stance on global injustice. Ibrahim Traoré's emotional outburst and fierce clarity marked a moment of defiance that deeply resonated with many around the world, particularly those who feel silenced, ignored, or oppressed. Whether seen as heroic or incendiary, his reaction to the Israel-Gaza affair was impossible to ignore, and its aftershocks are still unfolding. Ibrahim Traoré did not stop at words alone. In the days following his explosive speech, he took concrete diplomatic steps that further signaled his uncompromising stance. Burkina Faso recalled its ambassador from countries seen as endorsing Israel's actions and suspended bilateral talks with several Western nations. In a highly symbolic move, his government also announced it would host a solidarity summit for Palestine in Ouagadougou, inviting leaders from across Africa and the global South to discuss coordinated political and humanitarian responses. Traoré emphasized that African nations must no longer be passive spectators in global crises, especially when the same colonial structures that once oppressed them continue to operate under new names and alliances. His message was clear. Africa must rise not only for its own people, but also for all oppressed peoples worldwide. At the heart of Traoré's outrage was a deeply human sentiment. He spoke of children buried beneath rubble, of mothers screaming in hospitals without electricity, of fathers digging through debris with bare hands. His voice cracked as he described the emotional weight of watching these scenes unfold while the international community debates resolutions and ceasefire terms. To him, these were not political matters but moral imperatives. He criticized media outlets that sanitized the violence or framed it in one-sided narratives. When bombs fall on the innocent, it is not a conflict, it is a crime, he declared. This framing resonated with millions across Africa and the Middle East, many of whom expressed solidarity with his speech on social media, hailing him as one of the few leaders willing to speak truth to power. International responses were swift and mixed. While countries like South Africa, Algeria, and Mali praised Traoré's bravery, several Western nations expressed strong disapproval. Some diplomatic missions reportedly sought clarifications or retractions, fearing that his words could incite unrest or influence other African leaders to adopt similarly confrontational positions. But Traoré doubled down, stating that truth is not a threat, silence is. His spokesperson later clarified that Burkina Faso was prepared to face diplomatic consequences if it meant standing on the right side of history. This bold defiance positioned him not just as a national leader, but as a voice for a rising bloc of nations tired of the world order's imbalance. Domestically, Traoré's reaction galvanized the public. Massive rallies were held in Ouagadougou and other cities, where citizens carried Palestinian flags alongside the Burkina flag. Youth groups organized solidarity campaigns, raised donations, and held prayer vigils for victims in Gaza. The national media gave extensive coverage to Palestinian suffering, creating a new wave of political consciousness, especially among younger generations. Analysts noted that Traoré had successfully transformed a foreign policy stance into a domestic rallying cry for unity, justice, and African dignity. His popularity surged, and even critics admitted that his handling of the issue had reignited a sense of purpose and activism within the country. What makes Ibrahim Traoré's reaction so significant is not just the moral clarity of his message, but the strategic implications it carries. By positioning Burkina Faso as a frontline advocate for oppressed peoples, he has challenged the traditional boundaries of African diplomacy. He has turned a global tragedy into a moment of awakening, encouraging African nations to reclaim their voice on the world stage. Whether this bold trajectory will translate into lasting influence remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: his angry, passionate, and fearless response to the Israel-Gaza crisis has forced the world to reckon with a new, unapologetic Africa that refuses to be silenced. Beyond the speeches and symbolic gestures, Ibrahim Traoré's administration began mobilizing Burkina Faso's humanitarian and civil infrastructure to assist the people of Gaza. Despite being a country facing its own economic and security challenges, Traoré ordered the creation of a special aid fund for Palestine, calling on citizens, businesses, and regional partners to contribute. He also instructed the Ministry of Health to coordinate with international NGOs to prepare medical supplies, and offered to host wounded Palestinian civilians in Burkina Faso hospitals if safe corridors could be arranged. This act, seen by many as a powerful display of solidarity, shifted the narrative. Burkina Faso, a country long on the receiving end of international aid, was now extending compassion outward, proving that dignity and moral courage are not bound by economic power. The emotional gravity of Traoré's reaction was amplified by his own revolutionary background. Known for his Pan-African ideals and military origins, Traoré framed the Gaza issue as a continuation of the global struggle against imperialism. In one particularly striking remark, he compared the bombs falling on Gaza to the bullets once fired at African revolutionaries resisting colonization. "If we claim to honor our own martyrs, we must recognize theirs too," he said, linking Africa's historical pain to present-day global injustices. This rhetorical bridge between African memory and Palestinian suffering helped build a broader sense of global solidarity among grassroots movements. Student unions, civil rights organizations, and even artists across the continent began aligning their messages with Traoré's stance, using the crisis to highlight enduring issues of colonial legacies, occupation, and structural inequality. Ibrahim Traoré's powerful intervention in the Israel-Gaza affair may ultimately mark a defining moment in his leadership and in the geopolitical positioning of Burkina Faso. By stepping into a role often avoided by African heads of state, that of the unapologetic moral challenger, he has shifted perceptions of what African diplomacy can look like. His reaction has inspired calls for a new African doctrine on foreign affairs, one that centers human dignity, justice, and mutual solidarity over cautious neutrality and dependence on Western approval. Whether his bold approach sets a precedent for other leaders remains uncertain, but his message is now deeply etched into the global political landscape. Through anger, clarity, and fearless conviction, Ibrahim Traoré has made it impossible for the world to ignore either Gaza's suffering or Africa's awakening voice.